Good evening, I'm Ron Brown. Mississippi's 3.5-month legislative session has come to an end. Lawmakers spent more than 100 days under the Capitol Dome vowing to make sure that public education, Medicaid, and other needs were properly funded. But how much did they get done and what was left unfinished? Tonight we're going to take a look back at the session and recap the bills that passed and those that didn't. But first, here's a review of some of the key events from the 2008 legislative session. The 2008 legislative session began in high drama with an old-fashioned political showdown. With 28 years of experience, House Speaker Billy McCoy, a Democrat from Rienzi, has had his fair share of battles with Republicans. But this year, one of McCoy's toughest opponents came from within his own party. Jeff Smith, a Democrat from Columbus, mounted a serious takeover challenge for the Speaker's job. McCoy clashed frequently with Governor Haley Barbour over the past 4 years, and many thought that it was time for a change. The vote was close, with McCoy getting 62 votes to Smith's 60 to keep his position as Speaker of the House by the narrowest of all possible margins. When it came time for McCoy to choose chairmanships, the Speaker's most powerful responsibility, McCoy chose moderate or progressive Democrats. There would be more showdowns to come. With a state full of outdoor sportsmen, House Bill 1089 allowed deer hunters to lay out bait to attract their prey. The bill was controversial in some quarters because it seemed to many that drawing deer to the hunters seemed a little like shooting fish in a barrel. Sponsor Derek Parker, a Democrat from Loosedale, says hunters in his district overwhelmingly support the idea.
Basically, I think over the years, supplemental feeding has been a big part of deer hunting. We've been able to do that for quite some times, but you have not been able to hunt over that. Of course, there's not clarity in that, and I think there's some discretion out there as far as the game warden how to implement or enforce that because there's no clarity there. And I think over the years we've seen a large increase in the hunters that would like to be able to hunt with a bait hunt over that feed or supplemental grain.
The bill passed in the House by a 68 to 51 vote. Then it passed in the Senate by 1 vote, 25 to 24. But Governor Haley Barbour had the bill in his sights, and with the stroke of a veto pen, he shot it down, saying that it was not consistent with the hunting tradition of fair chase.
That disappoints me because I think we had something in place, and I understand both sides of the argument. I hunt in South Mississippi. That's where I've hunted all my life, but I also hunt some in Hinds County, in the edge of the Delta, and I can understand both sides of the argument. In the place I hunt in Hinds County, I've got rolling hardwood hills and bottoms, and you can see for long distances plenty of cropland and acorns.
In the past, the public has been handcuffed when it came to getting basic information about arrest reports, but no more. One bill which had strong bipartisan support involved how much information law enforcement must release about the people they arrest and why they're being arrested. It passed overwhelmingly in the House and unanimously in the Senate. It provides the basics about where, when, and who was involved in any crime report. Democratic Representative John Mayo of Clarksdale says the public has the right to know what's going on.
Well, I introduced what the press is calling the Sunshine Bill on police reporting because I feel like the public has the right to know where crimes are being committed in their towns.
The Sunshine Bill defines what information is open under the state's open records law, including the officer's description of what happened during the arrest. Mayo says he has a lot of experience in trying to get that basic information from law enforcement.
Well, having been a reporter, I know it's sometimes hard to get information from a police or sheriff's department. Other times it's easy. A lot of times, police chief, sheriff, they're just reluctant to share information because they feel like they're also the guardian of that information, and I understand that.
Similar legislation has been defeated in past years, but Mayo argued successfully this year that the legislation is important not only to journalists trying to gather information, but also because specific crime information and statistics can be used as a public safety issue.
For example, if a particular shopping place is a hotbed for carjackings, although you don't want to hurt the business, but the public has the right to protect itself in knowing that particular crimes are being committed in a particular part of town or in a particular business. will make them be more on guard when they go to that area.
Investigative information that might impact any case remains confidential and will not be released. House Speaker Billy McCoy had strong words to say at a public meeting in his state capitol office when an attempt to override a Governor Barbour veto failed. Barbour had vetoed a bill aimed at Chinese imports that contain lead or other hazardous materials in their toys. The bill would have allowed lawsuits over dangerous toys to be filed under the Mississippi Consumer Protection Act. The bill passed overwhelmingly, but Republican lawmakers who approved the bill the first time around would not vote to override Barbour. Ed Blackman, a Democrat from Canton, said it was raw politics.
It seems to me, and it's unfortunate, that anything in time the Attorney General of this state, Jim Hood, says, I'd like something, I'd like some piece of legislation to assist or help in protecting the people of this state, the governor feels duty-bound, more or less honor-bound, to oppose it. And I think absent that particular factor in this legislation, he would not have found a way to come up with a reason to veto it.
Governor Barbour said he was concerned that the bill could undo some of the state's tort reform laws. One proposed bill that was served up with the hopes of drawing interest to the state's health problems worked, but maybe it was a little too well done. Republican Representative Ted Mayhall of DeSoto County wanted to get people talking about the problem with an expanding overweight population. He proposed making it against the law for restaurants to serve food to obese people. The obesity bill, as it came to be known, ignited a media feeding frenzy.
It went all over the world. Somebody put it out on the Drudge Report. I was getting calls from, BBC, Australia, Canada, everywhere, all over Ireland. And they were calling in such numbers. It was a media frenzy. And I had to cut my telephones off for 2 days because I couldn't get anything done. It was just constantly ringing, my house phone, my cell phone. Same thing down in public health. Chairman Holland had to cut his phones off.
Mayhall said he never really intended for the bill to become law. He said he wanted to start a discussion about health risks and get people talking about some solutions.
We were going to have hearings on it, and medical experts come in and testify to bring more attention to the seriousness of the problem. That's what the Governor Barbour suggested we do. I showed it to him, ran it by him before I dropped the bill. Just didn't work out that way. He had to pocket veto it. We just couldn't stand the time it took.
The problem with Mississippi's health care issues didn't begin with Mayhall's obesity bill, and they certainly did not end there. How to come up with $90 million to pay for Medicaid was the dominant issue at the beginning of this year's legislative session, and nobody had an answer by the end of the session. And the problem hasn't been solved yet. The Medicaid budget funds the health care of about a quarter of the state's population. It takes care of the elderly in nursing homes, the disabled, and poor people who have no other means to health care. Republican Senator Dean Kirby is the chairman of the Finance Committee.
Well, we have a problem this year because of a change in some federal laws. Had we not had the change in the federal laws, we wouldn't have had any problems. But we're okay. We're going to be all right on this. I think the governor is working with not just the Senate, but the House, as well as the hospital associations and physicians and others. So we're going to be okay on that.
Other than the general tax increase, the options for funding Medicaid included raising the 18-cent tax on cigarettes to about $1 a pack and increasing the taxes on alcohol, a proposal approved by the Democratically controlled House. Barbour favors a different approach. He wants to tax hospitals to make up the deficit. Because legislators could not find a way to agree on funding the deficit-laden Medicaid program, Governor Barbour will have to call them back into a special session before July 1st.
But the Hospital Association's proposal came late in the session. We weren't able to get the numbers from the expert that they had hired in time for the end of the session. As you'll recall, this session typically runs 125 days after an election. The first session usually runs 125 days. We cut it back to 103. So we've still got 20 days or so that won't cost the taxpayers any extra than it would have anyway if we need to come back and deal with this issue before July 1st, and I think we do.
For the first time in 8 years, the 52-member Senate had a new leader at the helm. Lieutenant Governor Phil Bryant presided over his first legislative session. I sat down with Governor Bryant earlier this week and asked him about his impressions of the past session.
as Teddy Roosevelt once said, I think the credit must go to the man and the woman in the arena, and not to the critic. It's easy to set back sometimes after, like a ball game, and say, oh, they should have done this, maybe they should have passed when they ran. But overall, if you look at what we were able to do with our budget, to have level funding in state agency, we filled the rainy day fund, our state savings account, put $380 million, the first time in Mississippi history we've ever been able to do that. We held state expenditures to under 1%, under 1%. So the word that we're trying to send out across the nation is we're in the best financial condition in Mississippi's history. So that companies that want to come here, bond rating companies in New York that look at the financial condition of the state will say, we want to invest in Mississippi. So it helps. Those are things that perhaps the casual observer might not notice we were doing. Trying to remove what we call grafting from appropriation bills. And that's the language you put in appropriation bills that says you don't get your money unless you do these things. That shouldn't be done. Appropriation bills should be based on merit and outcome. So we worked really hard on the budget, but we fully funded MAEP, Mississippi Adequate Education, for the second year in a row. It's not an election year, but we funded education. Now that was the gold standard for years by the Department of Education. If we only got MAEP, this is the second year we've been able to do that. A teacher pay raise for 25 to 35 years, the most sweeping ethics law in Mississippi in the last 25 years, illegal immigration, one of the strongest bills in the nation. I'm happy about where we're at.
What legislation are you most pleased with to come out of this session that you can wave the banner and say, look at what we did?
I think, quite honestly, it's the budget process. It's not one piece, but it means so much to let Mississippians know that we are holding government accountable. As I said, we're in the best financial condition we've ever been in. We were able to fund IHL, fund community college, $16 million level funding at community colleges. We held state agencies down to where we were last year's levels with just a little bit of an increase. We call that level funding. Ethics laws is something I'm very proud of. I was state auditor for 11 years. You can't have good government without accountability, and that includes ethics. So what we want to know is, what are your financial interests as a legislature? So we're going to put those online so any Mississippian can go on a web-based site and find out through the Ethics Commission what our financial interests are. Where am I making money elsewhere that I ought to be reporting? They're going to have jurisdiction over open meetings. And so many of the times our government meets in secrecy, and that should not be. Any taxpayer has the right to go to a public meeting of any type, and we need to enforce that. Ethics will be able to do that. Public records. If I go into a government building and I want to see a public record, a document that's been generated by an employee of the taxpayer on taxpayer equipment or using taxpayer materials, those ought to be public records. And now that law will say it's accessible.
Why this year did we see all these ethics reforms? Was there something that that prodded us along that way? Was it just time? Had there been enough talk? Were the answers finally there?
I think, being state auditor for over a decade, I looked at state government and said, what's hindering us? Excuse me, what's an effect that that we can cure that will result in better government, more accountability, more access for the taxpayers? And it was ethics. Every time we look, we arrested over 100 corrupt public officials when I was state auditor, recovered over $12 million that had been embezzled and misspent. So I wanted to go in as lieutenant governor and say we're going to have the most ethical government in Mississippi history, and I think we've done that. Just today, the Clarion Ledger wrote an editorial about, again, how effective it has been. In 1979, the ethics laws was passed in this state by one vote in the Mississippi Senate. If it had not been for one senator voting yes, we would have never had an ethics laws. Now we've been able to expand that, and we're going to have good, honest government. So budgets, ethics, accountability, and illegal immigration.
I was just going to ask about that, about the illegal immigration. How important do you think that is? And the governor signed it with reservations, as I understand?
He did, but I think it's critical that we send a clear message that if you're going to come here and work in the state of Mississippi, you just need to be an American citizen. Or by law, you need to have a work visa and be here without violating our federal laws, without creating a false document like a Social Security card to come here and get a job. So we said something very simple. There's a program called E-Verify. It is free. It costs nothing for the employer. It's very easy to do. We ran all 5 employees in the Lieutenant Governor's office in a matter of minutes. You go on the computer, you use a Social Security number, a date of birth, and verify whether or not the individual you're hiring or that you have hired is in fact an American citizen, or whether or not that Social Security number matches his name. It's very easy and very simple. It's working in many states. The Director of Homeland Security says it's the most effective tool that we have for identifying illegal immigrants in this nation, and I think we need to keep the law in place.
Okay. Now, there were some people who said that this was a slow-moving session and that there may not have been as much public interest as in past years. Now, how did it seem to you? Did it seem that
fast-paced?
Did it really? It seemed like it was
every
here
day.
And gone.
We were moving so many things forward. Again, we looked at the bills that we've talked about, but we're going to put $500,000 into a medical examiner's program for the Department of Public Safety. We passed a law that said if you're a superintendent over a failing school district, first time this has ever been done, but failing school districts come back to accountability and leadership. So we're saying if you're superintendent and your school district is below a level 2 for 2 consecutive years, you're out. You are no longer superintendent, either an elected superintendent, they have to have a new election to replace him, or the board has to replace the appointed superintendent. That's a huge step for accountability in the election process for superintendents who oftentimes, not always, there's some good elected superintendents that do a very good job, but too often it's about politics and not results. And this has put real hard accountability in superintendents of the state of Mississippi. Never been done before.
Now, fair or not, there are going to be some people who are going to look at the legislative session and say, you know what, they didn't get the Medicaid funding bill passed, so there was some kind of failure associated with that. But you don't agree with that?
No, not at all. The federal government, as recently as this morning again, it was reported that they're looking at a package to help relieve states of the burden that we now have at Medicaid. By the way, other states are in much worse condition than Mississippi. We've got about a $90 million hole, as we call it, deficit in Medicaid. We've had that before. In fact, we voted for an $80 million deficit appropriation this year. So that's not anything that's unusual. The problem is, if we look at the predominantly Democratic House, one of the things that they wanted to do, and one of the things that's holding up the technical amendments bill, as we call it, was to do away with the face-to-face interviews, where people come in and say, I want to qualify for Medicaid, and I have to come in for an interview. They want to be able to do it by mail, and we just don't think that's an effective way of doing it. If the federal government would step forward and say, you know, we're going to add additional revenue to Medicaid for states, that would help relieve that problem. The Hospital Association has hired one of the nation's best experts to actually go in and look at the numbers that would be generated by the contribution made by both private and public hospitals, and to say how much money would that produce and how long would that money be in the Medicaid system. We won't have that information until several months. So it is much better. It's much better for us to go home now, get the accurate information from the experts that we know that are putting together programs for at least 20 other states similar to Mississippi, wait to determine if the federal government is going to provide assistance, and also there's a lawsuit that is ongoing between the Hospital Association and the governor, where the governor says, I have executive authority to manage Medicaid, particularly where we see the increase in the gross revenue assessment, and that the courts have not ruled on that. So there's several very good reasons for us not to rush to judgment.
So was this predetermined before the session even began, that we were not going to have Medicaid funding by the end of the session?
You know, we hoped, and we started where the House and the Senate was 1,000 miles apart. And we got within a couple of miles of each other. And then as we began to realize that the federal government, Congress, was moving to help relieve this problem. In fact, I have a letter from the Hospital Association that says we ought not do anything till we see what Congress is going to do. That's just good thinking. I mean, if you had a business and and you were about to make a loan and someone said, well, you know, we may have a windfall profit that would come in if we'll wait 30 days. The good thing to do would be wait. So it's just a prudent thing to do. I think we realized that it might happen. It was nothing that bothered us. We have the appropriation bill for Medicaid is separate from the technical amendments bill. We have funded Medicaid through March of '09. If we do nothing through March of '09, Medicaid is funded. So we've got plenty of time to go in and pass a technical amendments bill.
Okay, and coming up on a special session, of course, there will need to be one. What other bills are on there that are on the radar that you see
One
that
of the
need to be
things
done?
that is strange, we have an agency called Employment Security Commission, and it helps provide jobs, find jobs for Mississippians. They have the WIN job centers all over the state, and they pay unemployment. The House of Representatives decided that they wanted to attach to that bill. Every year, we have agencies that come over to sunset, as we call them, and you have to reauthorize that agency. It's a good control of government, but we were going to reauthorize the Department of Employment Security so they could continue to function. The House of Representatives attached an amendment to it that said they wanted to advertise for they wanted to take bids for advertisements. So if you bought an ad on talk radio or in newspapers, there was a very complicated process they wanted you to go through. Now, quietly, people were telling us that's because some Democrats in the House of Representatives don't like talk radio. So they were attaching this strange amendment to a bill that would simply reauthorize a very important state agency. We resisted that, and the bill died in committee. So that means if we don't do something by June 30th, the Department of Employment Security will cease to exist.
Well, that can't happen,
That cannot
obviously.
happen. Cannot happen. So we're going to have to add that to the call for a special session. But it is extremely frustrating to see how ineffective government can be when you have personal agendas. When you say, I don't like talk radio, I maybe don't like a newspaper, maybe I don't like public broadcasting, so I'm going to attach something, I'm going to graft something to an appropriations bill or to general language in a reauthorization bill. And it's not a good way to affect government, and that's unfortunate, and that's something that is very troublesome to me because I believe it deals with freedom of the press. And if we ever encroach upon those rights, we are on a slippery slope.
Okay. Well, why don't you handicap for me how this session went overall? I mean, it was your first session as the Lieutenant Governor. Would you?
I had a lot to learn, so it was the first session, but I think we did some remarkable things. Webcasting. Thanks to public broadcasting, anyone can go on their computer and see the session as we're conducting the important business and affairs of the Senate and the House. Excuse me. That is critically important. I was very proud of the senators, the leadership in the Senate. As you look at 52 members of the Senate, half Democrat chairman, half Republican chairman. So as we expanded the influence, we created tourism committees in the Senate. We created a housing committee. We created an ethics committee. So I'd say overall, we did a pretty good job down there. I'm very proud of that first session.
Were there any disappointments? And if so, what was your biggest disappointment?
Voter ID. You know, every year we have said we need a simple program that when you go into the polls and you present yourself to vote, you have to show an ID just to prove who you are. It happens, everyone knows the stories. When you rent movies, when you go to the airport, any number of things, you have to at least have some form of ID. And we just think it's a good system to assure that that individual that's about to cast that vote is who he says he is. It doesn't seem complicated. It won't cost anything. But again, the House of Representatives resisted that, and some senators, primarily Democratic senators, who believe it's an encroachment upon their civil rights. So I'm very disappointed we couldn't get that issue behind us once and for all, pass a good voter ID bill, and let's let that issue rest.
Why don't you think that it disenfranchises a certain amount of voters for for whatever
I
reason.
cannot imagine. We had any number of different IDs, voter IDs. For one thing, about 98% of the people in the state of Mississippi have a photo ID. It's called a driver's license. We put a provision in there that we would provide you an ID at no cost. But all you'd have to do is go by the public safety. We'd provide one for you. We would take a Social Security card. There was any number of things that we would say if you have anything. And if you had nothing, if you walked in and said, you know, I left my wallet, I don't have any form of identification, we'd let you vote by affidavit. And we'd later verify that that's who you are. But this is a troublesome problem that goes on. When people joke about dead people voting, when they joke about people who are in nursing homes that go and vote, that can't get out of bed. Something needs to be done. It's a simple, common sense method of saying, Mr. Bryant, could I see your ID?
And thanks to Lieutenant Governor Phil Bryant. Now, Speaker of the House Billy McCoy, who has 28 years in the Mississippi legislature and the past 4 years as Speaker. We talked with him earlier today at his Capitol office about his assessment of this year's legislative session.
Well, this makes 29 sessions I've been through, and they tend to run together after a while, but really there's always some difference. This one, I think, compared to the last 2 or 3 years, seemed to be less contentious so far as the differences between the Senate and the House and the legislature and the governor's office. So in that regard, it's been a better year, definitely.
Well, it started out a little bit rocky, obviously. There was a challenge for your job,
Right.
and it was a narrow victory on your part, and it came down to the wire, to the last day, maybe even to the last hour. How did that affect your ability to lead in the House?
Well, it always affects the process when you have a contentious political situation within a body. But overall, we've been able to work together, the whole House has, and we've had a very productive year. So it's just part of the political process that we're in now with the two-party system, and it will always be that way. So we have to learn to live with that, and it's something new to us, a total party divide. But we're working well within that.
No bruised egos, no bruised feelings on either side?
Certainly many bruised egos and feelings. Yes, sir.
But that didn't affect the way that legislation is passed.
It affects some, but again, the final product has been good. And so it's been a good process and a great experience.
Okay. One of the biggest issues in the session is always education. This year was no different. The governor just signed a measure that funds MAEP, that provides funding for dyslexia screening and salary increases for experienced teachers. Is this everything that you wanted on the education front?
Not quite, but it's a very good package, and having been a past chairman of education for 8 years, and having such a tough time all during the history of the legislature throughout the years, especially in modern years, to fund the type of program we need to have really quality opportunities, it's really rewarding to see the full funding. Not everything has been done, but it's a really good educational program. Based on the revenues we had, it's especially good.
Was there anything else that you wanted to see done that wasn't?
Well, of course, we'd always like to keep teacher salaries and employee salaries really competitive so we can have the very best in the classroom and in the whole system.
Now, a number of measures passed, including the country of origin labeling for imported catfish, for example, and a stronger ethics law, as you know. What other legislation is going to greatly affect us here in Mississippi?
Well, I always look at tangible things. We were not able to do. I'm going to back up a little bit and talk about what we weren't able to do.
Okay.
We're disappointed that we weren't able to do more with a transportation program to come with a very modern and up-to-date and progressive new construction program. We can't afford to let our state infrastructure in roads go backwards. And we're in dire need of having a really strong construction and renovation and repair program.
Okay, what other legislation do you think that did pass, maybe a little under the radar, maybe didn't get enough press coverage, maybe there weren't enough people out there applauding it, that you thought, you know what, that's going to be very important?
Well, I have to think a little bit. I believe that we passed several judiciary measures. I'm not going to try to get into them all, but we're constantly trying to make the state safer for the citizens. And so we passed some really good judiciary measures that I believe make protection of life and property for the citizens much better.
Okay, now on the other side of that coin, there are some people who will argue that this was a slow legislative session and that not much was done and that the public wasn't that interested. How would you respond to that?
Well, just depends on the observer, I guess. But I would disagree with that. We don't have to make big headlines to do the job for the citizens. Again, sometimes this process is rather mundane and uninteresting. But overall, I think it's been a very productive year for the citizens.
It's getting more and more easy, simple even, to watch how the legislators do their job of passing laws with webcasts on the internet. Do you think that that's something that's going to give people a greater appreciation of what you do and how you do? People are going to use it, do you think?
For those who are really interested, it most certainly will. The House of Representatives has been a leader, a legislative leader, and I certainly have tried to be a leader in this and having total openness in government, most especially that involves the legislature, the House of Representatives. We're strong advocates for openness at all levels. Open records, open meetings. We've been leaders in opening up the whole conference process here so a citizen or interested party could be right in the room in the whole process from the time a bill is introduced till it goes to subcommittee, committee, the body, and finally, whether it's the Senate or the House, and finally on to the conference process and back to see how it's handled after conference. Openness is most important in government, whether it be a meeting or a record. And the fact that we now have cameras in the chamber is so important. And so citizens can actually see and hear the final product being brought forward in the two chambers.
Mm-hmm. So if anybody has a criticism that not much was done, maybe they weren't paying attention, maybe they weren't watching.
Well, again, sometimes it's a not so interesting process. Sometimes it's very interesting. Some of the best proceedings that one would want to witness take part right here in these two chambers. And it's for somebody that likes this as a sport, it's a pretty good sport if they want to watch it. If they get tired of ultimate fighting.
This is a good option, I take it.
Yeah.
All right, well, what about the immigration bill? That was another high-profile bill that certainly didn't go under the radar.
Well, states and cities and counties should not have to be dealing with illegal immigration. That's a national issue where our presidents, and I say plural, our presidents and the Congresses have let us down through the years. Now then it seems it's left up to the state and local government entities to try to deal with this very serious problem. And so the state has taken a most, our approach to this bill is pretty tough, and we don't apologize for it.
Well, after 3.5 months of this session, we still don't have Medicaid funding.
That's correct.
I mean, and that was very high profile. Did you foresee that from the beginning of the session? Could you have called that? Did you know at the end of the session we wouldn't get this done?
I really thought we would get it done. It's one of the most serious subjects that we have to deal with. The funding increases so much each year. It seems like that the increase in revenue that comes to the state normally, just through normal increases, is consumed by three major budgets: Medicaid, public education, and corrections. Medicaid being a tremendous, tremendous budget requirement for us. And not only did we have to look at this year, the current year, where we have a shortfall, but then we have to look at the long-range program, finance program for Medicaid. And I really thought that we would be able to come with a solution to both of them before the session was over. And it's not that anybody was mean and evil or even obstinate, but everybody's working, the governor's working, the two legislative bodies are working, and interested parties such as the Hospital Association are working. And I believe it took just a little bit more time, and I believe when we come back in special session that the solution will have probably been agreed to. I really hope so. The members do.
Okay, now looking ahead to next year already, you get through one session already, you're already looking to next year. What's the top priority going to be, or what would you like to see it be for next session?
Well, again, it's sad that the first thing we always look to is the state finance, but that's most important. We really hope we'll have stable revenues next year, but the national economy being what it is and fuel prices being what they are, we know we're going to have a challenge with the budget again. And it's imperative that we do the things we ought to do in education, that we don't just go to a status quo level with many of our other state agencies such as wildlife, fisheries, and parks, and marine resources, and all the places that really, what I would say, add fertilizer to the state's opportunities. We can't be status quo. And again, I point out we have 3 big budget items that really tear at the whole process so far as giving opportunities in other areas. So we have a challenge with the budget first and foremost.
Okay. All right. Well, we thank you very much for your time. We appreciate it, and we look forward to talking to you again real soon.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
Now, once the 2008 legislative session is gavelled to order, lawmakers aren't the only ones roaming the halls of the Capitol. Joining us now to talk about bills that passed and bills that didn't pass are 2 people who have a legislative agenda of their very own. We welcome Pam Shaw, the Senior Policy Consultant with the Children's Defense Fund, and Frank Yates, the Executive Director of the Mississippi Association of Educators. Thank you very much, both of you, for being here with us on this show.
Thank you for inviting us.
Well, Pam, briefly, why don't you tell us what's the Children's Defense Fund and its mission so we get to know?
The Children's Defense Fund's Leave No Child Behind mission is to ensure every child a healthy start, a head start, fair start, safe start, and moral start in life and successful passage to adulthood with the help of caring families and communities. CDF provides a strong, effective voice for all of America's children who cannot vote, lobby, or speak for themselves. We pay particular attention to the needs of poor and minority children and children with disabilities. CDF encourages an investment before children get sick, in trouble, or drop out of school. We're a private, not-for-profit organization, and we have never received government funds.
Okay, you were watching the legislative session very carefully. You were down there a number of times, I imagine. As it relates to children's issues, how would you rate this session?
Children were not a priority for the legislators this session. There were a number of bills that we were in support of that did not get the response we would have liked. We would have liked the elimination of the face-to-face for certification, recertification for Medicaid. Medicaid is a tremendous health program for the state of Mississippi. 56% of the children, 56% of the people on Medicaid are children. They cost 24% of the Medicaid budget. What we've had happen in Mississippi is 70,000 children lost health insurance, Medicaid, and or CHIP since January of '05, and it's because the face-to-face recertification.
And that's something that you spoke to a number of legislators about this year, I take it? And
it was actually one of the things that the House of Representatives supported and attached to the appropriations bill that said in order for this Division of Medicaid to receive funding, they needed to get rid of that. And you actually had senators, conferees, and House conferees to agree to that. And the Lieutenant Governor decided it wasn't a good idea.
Okay, so that's something that you are going to be paying close attention to in this upcoming special session.
In the upcoming special session.
And make the case once again.
And make the case once again. And also the cigarette tax. We believe increasing the tax on cigarettes by $1 is absolutely a way to fund Medicaid as we move forward. It has a positive impact on children by reducing the number of children who smoke, who even began, and it helps adults quit smoking.
Okay, Frank, briefly, why don't you tell us about the Mississippi Association of Educators?
The Mississippi Association of Educators was started back in 1878, at the time when Mississippi was not, as a state, supporting public education. And our beginning at that time was to provide for classroom teachers who were certified. Most teachers at that time had a 6th grade education. And it was to cause, so our mission has been to cause the state of Mississippi to provide education for every child, as well as to improve the lot of those teachers who teach those children.
Okay, the governor signed a bill yesterday that fully funds MAEP. It gives raises to some teachers, and it provides money for early childhood education and money for teacher supplies. Is that what MAE wanted?
It is, but not to the extent that we needed and wanted it. fully funding the MAEP has been a mission that we have been on for about 5 years now, and have spent a lot of interest in that. The teacher supply money is inadequate. Teachers just can't do the job they need to do without the resources they need. And we're happy that the extension or the increments for teachers was provided, because that keeps some teachers on board that otherwise would leave and go somewhere else. But for those other teachers who did not get an across-the-board pay raise, that was inadequate.
Okay, well, what kind of legislation will help failing or financially troubled schools? Just this week, the governor signed off on the takeover of North Panola schools. Could this measure have helped them then?
Well, if the full funding of MAEP had been a reality for the last 10 years or more, then I don't think we'd have these kind of problems the schools are facing. If we look at most of the failing schools, they fall in the area where there's very little industry or any other resources for the school districts to get a tax base. And that's where you find most of the problems. There's not a tax base for them to upgrade education in those areas, and that's a tough challenge. And the fact that MAEP has not been fully funded means that it placed the extra burden on those districts in those situations.
Okay, Pam, let's go back to you. Now, the Medicaid $90 million shortfall is still undecided. We know that, facing a possible, probable special session. Now, although Lieutenant Governor Phil Bryant says that Medicaid has enough money through early 2009, your thoughts on leaving this unfinished business, and what is it that you'd like to see done again in the special session?
Healthcare is very important to the citizens of this state. And again, Medicaid is the primary health care for lots of people, for children, for adults, for the disabled, for the providers who provide these services in these communities. Leaving a $90 million deficit isn't good sense, particularly when you have an opportunity to fill that deficit. Medicaid needs a dedicated stream of income, revenue, so that we won't have the same problem year after year after year.
Mm-hmm. You don't have any concerns that it's not going to be funded. You don't have any concerns that they're not going to get the job done in this special session, do you?
Who knows? I mean, I never know what they're going to do. They don't do what I tell them to do or ask them to do. If we did, we'd have a much more money invested in children.
Mm-hmm. So your faith isn't very high up there as far as...
No, that they'll do what I consider the right thing.
Mm-hmm.
No. If it did, we'd have the cigarette tax to fund Medicaid.
That's the way you believe it should be taken care of.
That's the way I believe.
Okay, well, some people have said that this session moved slowly and was unproductive. What about you two? How would you assess it? Do you think that it moved slowly? Do you think that it moved quickly? That's what Lieutenant Governor Bryant said. He thought it zipped right by.
I thought it was difficult to engage in what was going on this session. I thought it was, in some levels, there was media fatigue. It was really difficult to energize the masses of the people about what was happening, because there are only a few hot button issues. Education is a hot button issue. Mm-hmm. Teacher pay raise is a hot button issue. If the Division of Medicaid had sent out letters to patients, to recipients saying we were running out of funding, that would have been a hot button issue. So there were only a few hot button issues that would have engaged the public, and we didn't have those this year.
Okay, and Mr. Gates, your impression as well?
Well, we think that probably the general public felt that there were the promises that were made on the campaign trails, and they kind of the first year give the legislators the benefit of the doubt that they're going to fulfill what they said they were going to do, especially around education while they were out on the campaign trail. So now they've had an opportunity to see a full session and see what has happened versus what they were told when the campaigns went on. So I think that had some impact. People were willing to see if the legislators were really going to do what they said they were going to do when they were running for office, and other office holders also at statewide level.
Okay, hold them accountable. Thank you very much. We thank you to Pam Shaw with the Children's Defense Fund for being here, and Frank Yates from the Mississippi Association of Educators. In just a few moments, several Mississippi journalists are going to join us to analyze the accomplishments and the failures of the 2008 legislative session. But first, we're going to take this short break.
Hi, I'm Walt Grayson, host of Mississippi Roads, and I'm here to let you know about a big change coming February 17th, 2009. TV is going digital. Now, if you receive your television signal through an antenna of any kind, you'll need to get one of these. This is a digital converter box in order to keep watching television. Now, if you subscribe to a cable service or a satellite service, you probably won't need to do anything. You could buy a digital television, but the converter boxes will work just fine. Now, these boxes should cost between $40 and $70, and coupons are available through the federal government. And make sure that the box you buy carries this yellow triangle. To get one of these coupons, simply call the number right down below, and then go online to mpbonline.org for more information about the transition.
Mississippi legislators ended the 2008 session late last week after spending more than 100 days at the state capitol. Was it time and money well spent? 3 Mississippi journalists are here to analyze what was done and maybe what was not done. We welcome to the program Sid Salters, who's the perspective editor at the Clarion Ledger newspaper, Emily Wagster Pettis, the Capitol reporter for the Associated Press, and John Callahar, the statewide reporter with WLBT Television in Jackson. Thank you all for being here. 3.5 months, more than 100 days at the Capitol. You all probably spent all those days there. Well, did we get our money's worth for this year's session? How would you assess it? Sid?
I think we had a no-money session, a session in which the budget was tight because of the Medicaid deficit, because of rising energy prices that affected all budgets across the spectrum of state government. So far, a no-money session. I think some progress was made in several areas, but no sweeping changes and no historic legislation passed this time.
Emily, what do you think?
I think Sid's right. In a year when the budget is tight, it's difficult to make very many significant changes. They did do a couple of important things. One of them was to increase the incremental pay for teachers with 25 to 35 years experience. There's been a real problem with these veteran teachers kind of topping out in salary and wanting to move on. So that's one significant thing.
Okay, John, what do you think was the most significant piece of legislation? What's going to have the greatest impact on us here in Mississippi, and maybe what may have flown under the radar?
Well, talking about something that flew under the radar, something that was talked about a lot, and then when it passed, the pay-as-you-go public utilities, when it passed, it really wasn't talked about all that much. I did talk to the chairman of that, the Public Utilities Committee in the House of Representatives, Tyrone Ellis, and he said, you know, this basically just gives the power to the public service commissioners to raise rates gradually as they build those power plants. And one thing that he did say, there is a clause in there that will give money back if they do not finish those plants. So that's something that was talked about early, but when it passed, not so much. So that is on to the governor. Okay, education always dominates the session. MAEP was fully funded. Now, what measure is going to have the greatest impact on the state's school children, do you think?
As Emily noted, I think the biggest impact long term will be investing in veteran teachers through incremental pay increases. That should keep veteran teachers teaching longer, keep their influence on younger teachers. So I think that was probably the most significant education bill. Fully funding MAEP, appreciating the historic value of that. It's never been done other than an election year. Doing it in the first year of a term is something that some of us that have been watching government for a long time never thought would happen. So I think those two developments are important.
So that was a big surprise. What other big surprises? What caught you off guard, said you can't believe it?
I was a little surprised that they got into such open warfare over House Bill 1240, the so-called lead paint bill over toys. The bill passed both houses almost unanimously, and then the governor decided to veto it, and he said he was concerned that the bill would engender additional lawsuits, but there was sort of a general wink and nudge around the Capitol is that it was all right to keep a list of bad toys. I'm not sure the governor exactly wanted Attorney General Jim Hood to be in charge of keeping the list, and the enmity between those two figures is fairly well known. So I think that was a surprise to me. The surprise over the disagreement, or the surprise that the legislation didn't pass? It's difficult to imagine legislators voting or acting in a manner not to protect children from toys, from having lead paint on their rattlers. So, that was a little surprising. Okay. Well, an issue that some folks may not have paid a lot of attention to involves ethics reform. We in the media, of course, had that high on our radar with the Sunshine Bill. Why is it so important to the public, do you think, Emily?
There are a couple things in that are important to the public. For one, your average everyday citizen at some point will be able to go online, log on, and find out what financial interests public officials have. And so if you want to know if somebody has stock in a certain company or if they may have some financial conflict, that information will be more readily available. Also, the Ethics Commission is getting the power to be sort of the first enforcer of disputes over open meetings. And so say the city council goes into closed session for something and a citizen is there and they feel like the session was closed improperly, instead of having to go directly to court and file a lawsuit, which can be very expensive, they could go to the Ethics Commission as kind of a mediator to take care of that first step.
Mm-hmm. Well, it also includes arrest reports, John, where a reporter like yourself has not always had access to the information, all the information that we will have after July 1st or July 2nd. Very important to us?
Oh, I think so. I think, you know, I was listening to one of the pieces earlier, and I think letting people know where certain crimes are taking place is very important. But, you know, people may not always go down to the police station or whatever to get those reports, and, you know, the media having access to that, to get that information out there, definitely important. Okay,
for everybody, not only just the media.
Right.
We hear that Medicaid's facing a $90 million deficit. Have you all heard about this?
Yes.
I mentioned it.
Yeah, that's got a little bit of press coverage, and rightly so. Is it really critical enough to go to a special session, and should it have been taken care of, in your opinion, without a special session?
The agency does apparently have enough money to get through at least next March. The big problem is responsibility. Governor Barbour says it would be irresponsible to start the budget year knowing they have that big hole. Now, okay, they did this a year ago and they ended up having to deal with it in this regular session. But I think that just for the reassurance not only of the people in the program, but also the physicians and the physical therapists and the hospitals and all the others who provide the Medicaid services, the legislators and the governor want to go ahead and deal with this.
My question is, I mean, they knew about it going in. They knew about they'd have to fully fund education as well. Why drag it out and wait till the end of the session, or in Medicaid's case, a special session? I mean, why can't they go ahead and agree on the front end, which, you know, I guess that'll never happen. That's a dream world. But, you know, why drag it out if you knew that going in that you were going to have to do that? You're going to have to find that $90 million.
Yeah. Is it a waste of money, the special session, for that reason?
Not necessarily, because a special session as set by the governor is a more focused exercise. There's less opportunity for mischief and less opportunities to chase political or partisan rabbits. They have to stick to the call that the governor issues. I think the Medicaid problem is as much about partisanship and as much about the means to fund Medicaid rather than coming up with the funding itself. They knew they had the problem. They knew they had it to do. Where they tore the blanket was over how to do it.
Mm-hmm. And that still has to be resolved. What issues were not addressed, though, that you think should have been this session?
Oh gosh, how much time do we have?
That many.
I think that, again, given the overall premise that the House and Senate faced a year where there was very little additional money, you know, an obvious area of need is higher education, and higher education really got left out in the cold this session. Bonding, you had $97 million round numbers in bonds to retire, $95 million to come on, so your level in bonded indebtedness are close to it. But higher education really got left out, and I think if there was one crying need, that's probably it.
Okay, does everybody agree with that? That was...
Yes, and I think also if you look at the other end of the spectrum on education, if you look at early childhood education, they did end up putting about $3 million into that, and that's basically going to provide some financial incentives for child care centers to increase their educational offerings for the, you know, for the little kids, for the 1, 2, and 3-year-olds. Mm-hmm. That's not very much money in a state this size. Every other state in the nation puts money of some kind into early childhood education, and that's a very critical age for those kids. You know, you get them while they're young and get them some early literacy skills.
And the money's not really going into a state early childhood education program. It's bolstering the federal Head Start program is what it's doing. And so Mississippi still hasn't addressed early childhood education, even with $3 million thrown at the problem.
I think if you look at something else that did not get through is something that I think the Senate was pushing for was the pay raises for district attorneys, for judges, assistant district attorneys, and that fight seemed like it came down to, well, if you're not going to raise our pay as legislators, then we're not going to pay anybody else either. So that was something I thought that was a little tit for tat there, going back and forth. And you know, some of these judges don't make what they should, and I think they need to get pay raises.
Okay, well, this has been a tough year to get that through with all the problems that we've had with the judicial scandal. Well, this was Lieutenant Governor's first session. How would you rate his performance this legislative session?
Well, I tell you what, he was very open every time I came into his office to talk about whatever subject I wanted to talk about. But you know, there were a lot of things I think that he would have liked to have seen get through. Pay raises is one for the judges, but you know, I think he's definitely feeling his way, just like many of the freshman legislators. I think he, you know, first term, pretty good. We'll see what he does the next 3 years.
Okay, Emily, you wrote an article touting the governor's success in this session. How influential is he in the legislative process?
He's incredibly influential. Even if he's not physically in the room, he really has his allies working very closely with him. And so he's always a presence in there. And he's, I've been covering state government since 1994, so I've covered, what, 3 governors now. And he's by far the most active and the most effective because he just knows how to work the system. Okay,
what's an overall grade for the 2008 legislative session, Sid?
A B plus.
That's not that bad.
Not really. I mean, for as I said at the top of this, for a no money session, it was reasonably productive. They hit the major issues that they had to deal with in a reasonably responsible way.
Okay, next year it's going to be right around the corner. It'll be in front of us before we even know it. I know John's shaking his head, but it's gonna happen.
I shudder at the thought.
What do you think is going to be some of the high impact legislation that we're going to look at next year?
Well, something that was brought up that was very controversial was the Child Protection Act, or the abortion bill that was brought up. We talked about that in the room earlier, and that was something that you know, was argued over, and I think you know, a lot of people wanted to pass it. It was held up by one chairman who decided to pull it off the table there and not allow a vote. But I think that's something that's definitely going to come back. They're going to try to get stiffer, you know, with abortion in the state.
Okay, Sid, do you agree with that?
It'll be back. It could be back in special session.
Okay, and Emily, what do you think next year are we going to see that's going to leave its mark on the session?
I think there's going to be a lot of discussion about taxes next year. Governor Barbour has a tax study commission that's working right now. They're supposed to release some sort of report sometime around August. And so I think they're going to make some recommendations to make some probably fairly significant changes in the tax structure. And I would anticipate that this is going to just dominate the discussion.
Okay. Well, with the popularity of podcasts and webcasts, and of course blogging is getting more and more popular as we go along, is that going to impact how legislators do their work with more people watching, at least more people that are able to watch?
It already has. Blogging has had an impact, a significant impact. The podcast gives a much broader audience to behavior inside the chamber, and so it's already had an impact, and that impact will continue to grow.
Okay. Well, we thank you very much. That's all the time that we have for tonight's program. I'd like to thank our journalists, Sid Salter from the Clarion Ledger, Emily Wagster-Pettis from the Associated Press, and John Callahar from WLVT Television. We also want to thank you for tuning in. And if you missed any part of our program or you'd like to view it again, we invite you to visit our website at mpbonline.org. That's mpbonline.org. I'm Ron Brown. Good night.